welcome. In this session, we would focus on how the things changed from agriculture. It was not just the transformation of forest lands into agriculture, but at the same time, social differentiation started. Now, this social differentiation that started led to formation of the various clans, the jatis, the varnas, and again, it led to unequal distribution of wealth. Along with all these, there was idea to understand the text, who wrote the text, what was the language of the text, how we could decipher the text, and therefore there was a wide range of appraisal, understanding how the things evolved from the 600 BC to 600 AD. Now, under this, we focus first on Mahabharata. Mahabharata is one of the most epical formats with more than 1 lakh verses which are there, and this have been composed over a grand period of more than 1000 years of history and considered as one of the most richest texts. Now, V.S. Suthankar in 1919 wrote the critical edition of Mahabharata, and the idea was to understand how historians reconstruct the social histories. Now, various Sanskrit manuscripts were created. It's important to note that the Sanskrit that was used in Mahabharata was relatively simple as compared to the Sanskrit which was used in Vedas. Now, this text, which were written in various parts of the world, various parts of India, had regional variations, and the teams actually read the manuscripts from each region of India and then selected the verses which appear common, and those were finally published in nearly 13,000 pages, and this took 47 years to complete. Now, in this, two things became very prominent. First was Sanskrit was a language for the priests and the elite group. For the common people, the language which was used was Pali, Prakrit in the north, and Tamil, Telugu in the south. And this created another differentiation. There were also regional variations seen within the various explanations of the social history, traditions, and the local ideas. And most of the writings, as we saw, if they were in Sanskrit, they were from the text or the ideas of Brahmins. Now, how the Brahmins looked towards the other sects of the society was mentioned. However, if the text was taken from Pali Prakrit of Tamil, this was from an orientation of a common man, and from a common man's orientation, what was the approach of Brahmins was taken. So, both of these had variations, and this was a really interesting aspect. The next is, during that time, how kinship and marriage happened. So, under kinship, we understand in Sanskrit there is a word kul. Now, kul explains the family, the genesis of family, and then jati, which is the huge number of kuls coming together, and we call them as kinfolk. So, kinfolks, families are part of these kinfolks or the janti, and then we have the term vansh. Vansh, which we say, or it is also called as Vamsh, is the lineage, the hierarchy, who came after whom, and how is your family tree going. So, families are tied naturally, or they are tied through blood relations. Now, for some, if a person is a cousin, we consider this to be a blood relation. For other sects, it is not considered as a blood relation. So again, there are variations as to how you believe your relatives are, and whether you consider your cousins as part of your close family or not. Again, if it is from the father's side, so father, son, grandfather, if that's or grandson, if that's the heritage or the hierarchy, we call it as patrilineal. And if it is from the mother's side, it is known as Martellini. Now, Mahabharata is a story which proves the idea of two cousins, Kauravas and Pandavas, fighting within themselves within the same family lineage. And therefore, this lineage dominated one of the Janpads, and this was known as the Kuru Panchal Janpad. So, there was the Matsya region, the Kuru region, the Avanti region of Ujjaini, the Vatsya, Kaushala, Malla, Saka, and these were the areas where the Kuru Panchal region was actually prominent. Now Hastinapur was considered as the main center. Now when sons succeeded to power, we call this as a patrilineal. In case there were no sons, brothers would succeed to power. In some case we have seen the kingsmen coming to power. In other cases women came to power. Prabhavati Gupta in the Chandragupta period is one such example. So Mahabharata talks about the conflict which ended in a battle on the battlefield where Pandavas emerged victorious, and this explained the hierarchy of patrilineal, which is the father's lineage which dominated. Now while patrilineal had existed to the epics which were present even before Mahabharata, this idea of patrilineal hierarchy actually became dominant after the episodes of Mahabharata. Now some of the texts are really interesting. For example, Kauravas were the son of Dhritarashtra. Now Dhritarashtra was blind and Pandav was one of the cousins. The younger brother of Dhritarashtra was Pandu. Now Pandu came to the throne of Hastinapur, the capital where this whole episode happened. And once there was a premature death of Pandu, then came Dhritarashtra to power. However, the eldest son of Kaurav, who was Duryodhan, was jealous of the Pandavas and their power. So then emerged this whole story of Mahabharata in line of this. The next is marriage. Now marriage can be explained under 4 types. Endogamy is within the same unit, within the same caste, the kin groupship. Exogamy is outside the caste, outside the group, outside the clan. Polygyny is where one can have many wives. And polyandry is where person can have many husbands. A wife can have many husbands, right? So Draupadi is an example where many husbands were there, and Draupadi is considered to be the wife of all Pandavas. So that is one case. Now sons were considered as important to maintain the patriarchy or the patriarchal lineage. However, daughters were viewed from a different perspective. It was believed that they were an important element of the household. However, when they are marrying, they would move to another lineage and they would have to adopt the kinship of that lineage. Now girls were married at a right time to a right person, and it was a religious duty of the father to actually do a kanyadan, that is the gift of daughter in marriage. Now whatever gifts and blessings the father gave to the girl were considered as a stridhan. It was believed from 500 BC the various norms were compiled regarding this in Dharma Sutra and Dharma Shastra, and all these works were later compiled also under Manusmriti. So Manusmriti was compiled somewhere between 200 BC to 200 AD, and there were various texts which talked about how the life should be, what should be the various forms of marriage. So there were 8 forms of marriage which were propounded, of which 4 were considered as good, the remaining 4 were condemned, and it is possible to actually consider these 8 forms of marriage practices under the various laws which were laid down under the Dharma Shastra. Now Gotra was again important. So the Gotra of the women changed after marriage. So after the marriage, the women had to adopt the Gotra of their husband and the family in which they have to be married. Now this is an interesting story from Satvahana kingdom. So Satvahana kingdom actually had some of the important leaders. For example, Raja Gautami Putra Sri Shatkarni. Now, Raja means king, Putra means son. That means he was the son of Gautami. Now, son of Gautami means Gautami was the feminine form of Gautam, and Putra of Vashishti, that means the feminine form of Vashishta. Now these were all considered as Vedic seerers, after whom the name of the Gotra were defined. The same happened in all of the major names under Satvahana rulers that we could see. Now these Brahminical practices actually were very important because, as we said, First of all, the Gotra was considered as descendant. The person were not allowed to marry within the same Gotra. The marriage was to be done outside the Gotra. Women, when married to a man, would have to adopt the Gotra of the men. And this also talked about the powerful lineage. Satvana is one such case where the Deccan Plateau became one of the important aspects. Also, many were talked about metronyms. Metronyms is the name derived from that of the mother. So metronymics is mentioned under the Brindakai Upanishad, which is considered as one of the major earliest forms of Upanishad. Also, in one of the texts, there is an interesting aspect about mother's advice. So, in Mahabharata, Duryodhan was the eldest son, and Gandhari made an appeal to Duryodhan. Duryodhan was jealous of the Pandavas, and when Gandhari made an appeal, the idea was that it is very important to understand that Pandavas are wise and heroic, and it is good that there is no war. Dharma has to be maintained. It should not be for profit motive, and happiness is there. Then everything would be all set. If there is no happiness, then there is no victory in the end, and that was one of the resultants, that Duryodhan did not listen to the mother and fought the war, ultimately lost the war. Now again, in the society, there were social differences. The various castes were well classified. So, under the divine order, Brahmins considered one of the verse which was known as the Purush Sukta, and under the Purush Sukta, it was believed that Brahmins were the mouth, Kshatriya were the arms, Vaishya were the thighs, and Shudra were the feet of the Brahma, and therefore they divided the various hierarchies in the given order. Now, Brahmins were supposed to study and teach Vedas, perform Vedic sacrifices, and give and receive gifts. Kshatriyas were the warriors, Vaishya were the traders involved with businesses and engaged with agriculture and pastoralism, and Shudra were considered as the untouchables, and they were the considered as least among the Varna segment. Now, Brahmins evolved 2 or 3 different strategies to maintain their position on the top. The first was they always wanted to assert this idea of divine order under the Purush Sukta. And under the Purush Sukta, the idea was Brahmins were the mouth of Brahma and therefore held a very important position. They advised the king always to follow these norms within their kingdom. And thirdly, they always wanted that the people should have their status determined at the time of birth. Now, these things maintained that Brahmins remain or have their sanctity or have their important position. Now, there is an interesting story about Eklavya. So once Dronacharya was teaching the various students, and this was when Eklavya was passing by, and Eklavya, since he belonged to a Nishad or a hunting community, he was said by Dronacharya that I won't teach you, and as a result he made a statue of Dronacharya of clay and practiced archery. Finally he became an excellent archer, and when Pandavas were going down, he shot and his 7 shots were exact, and this actually asked, by this Arjun actually went to Dronacharya and asked that you said there could not be any better archer than me. How can I find a better archer than me? As a result, Eklavya was taken to Dronacharya, and Dronacharya immediately recognized Eklavya. Eklavya bowed in front of Dronacharya and said that you are my guru and I am your disciple, and in lieu Dronacharya asked for Guru Dakshina, where he asked for the thumb. Now after his thumb was lost, he did archery, but it was never that perfect and never that fast as before, and as a result Dronacharya kept his word that Arjun, there is no better archer than Arjun. So this kind of social differences were marked and had an important position in the society. However, we have seen that Kshatriyas were the warriors. However, there were people from non-Kshatriya background who were also important kings. For example, the social background of the Mauryas are highly debated. Some in the Buddhist texts say that they were Kshatriyas. However, later texts say that they were Brahmins. Similarly, the Shung and the Kanap, they were considered as Brahmins. The Shakas who came from the Central Asia were considered as Melicha. That means they were the barbarians, and they were outside the Brahmin group. They were also the people who were not aware with the Sanskrit text. And also there were various aspects that we studied in the last chapter, where we talked about Rudradaman, who actually rebuilt the Sudarshan Lake without imposing tax on the common people. But again, he was considered as one of the important Melcha rulers, that is, from the barbarian clan, he was considered. Similarly, the Satvana, the Raja Gautamiputra Satkarni, belonged to Brahma, and they were considered as the destroyer of the pride of Kshatriyas. So it's not necessary that all the kings belong to the Kshatriya caste. The next is Jati and social mobility. So Jati are those who share common occupation. So there is a difference between Jati and Varna. Varna were well defined: four: Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. However, Jatis were many. There were no fixed four jatis that we could say, and the people who were living in forest, for example, they were called as nishad or hunters. Now together, all those doing similar kind of occupations were put together as a jati, and then when similar jatis were organized together, they were called as shenis or guilds. So what is sheni, what is guild is important. Now, one of the stone inscriptions in the region of Mandsaur in Madhya Pradesh talks about a group of silk weavers who actually heard about the greatness of one of the kings and moved from the original region in Lata in Gujarat to Mandsaur in Madhya Pradesh, and finally to Dashpur. And this was only because they heard about the greatness of the king, and this motivated them to shift their original place and move forward. Similarly, Sanskrit inscriptions talks about the term vanik. Vanik means merchants, and they were those who traded as in the occupation of the Vaishya, as explained in the various Shastra. So Vanik were basically the merchants, and similar to the Vaishya, which were classified under the Varna system. So this whole complex situation was brought, and there were various donations that were brought by the Kshatriya Vaniks as well. The next is integration and subordination. Now in Sanskrit, we define various things separately. So we talk about the Sanskrit framework as well as the non-Sanskrit framework. We already said Sanskrit was considered as the language of elite group. However, non-Sanskrit, which is Pali, Prakrit and Tamil, was considered as a language of common man. Similarly, integration was a main aspect, because we know the story of Bhim, Hidimba and Ghatotkacha. So it was believed that Hidimba turned herself into a beautiful woman and asked that Bhim should marry him. So she went to Kunti, and actually she was one of the sisters of man-eating Rakshas. But when she went to Kunti, she said that she wants to get married with Bhim, and later Yudhishthir approved it, and finally the idea was that they were allowed to be together during the day, and at the night Bhim had to return. However, later they had given birth to a child which was known as Ghatotkacha. Ghatotkacha said that whenever you need me, I'll be back. But once Ghatotkacha was born as Rakshas, Hidimba and Ghatotkacha actually left Bhim. And this was one of the things, or one of the stories, which was laid down to describe that the practices were very different from those laid down in the Brahminical text for the Rakshas. So there were various segments of the society which were considered outside the social setup. Similarly, under the Varna system, the Shudra were considered out of the society. They were not allowed to take pure food. They were considered as untouchable. They had to have this bell along on their back, and as they move, that bell would ring, indicating that there is a Shudra moving around. So they should not be brought in contact with the common people. So those kind of things happened, and their works were considered as polluting, because they had to get get involved themselves with handling the corpse or the dead animals, and therefore they were considered to remain outside certain limit. They were not allowed to enter the main limits of the city or the village during the night. They had to wear the clothes of the dead, the ornaments made of iron, and Manusmriti laid down the duties which were given for these called as chandalas, and they were actually cited by the Buddhist tourist, the Chinese tourist who came to India, for example, Fayan, and it was also given by Zhuanggang. So they cited the various cases where these chandalas had to live outside the city boundaries. They were not allowed to enter into the city areas, and there were guidelines prescribed for them in the certain text. So those were some of the things that we have covered in the first part of this theme 3. In the second part of the theme 3, we would continue with important topics that we have left so far. So stay tuned, stay subscribed.